Thank you very much. So, first Mayor Scholz, I got it right. And Peter Günzler, thanks for the nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, foundations of the world. I'm here as a climate scientist, but it is my task and my duty to communicate our findings to the world and to you also, who play a very important role in the global dialogue. So you see, my title is Turning the Climate Tide Now, and I try to underpin it scientifically why this title is actually the right one. So, now these are just a few glimpses in Europe. That is, what happens last week. You see the terrible forest fire in Portugal, where the spring rains just did not appear. And when in Berlin we had a monstrous precipitation event, actually the biggest one was raining for 20 hours, the biggest one since any records were taken in Berlin by the weather service. So is this something that has to do with climate change? Yes, it has. But if we look at just how the global mean temperature is rising, which is much easier to observe and to explain, you see 1880, when instrumental records started, we are now approaching the year 2020. And you see, it's of course like all lines in physics, it's sort of wiggly and going up and down. But since 1970, it's just rising and rising. And there has been some silly debates whether global warming is over after the last big El Nino event in 1998. But you see, even if there was a certain slowdown, it's accelerating again. And so we are going forward. Now, what is the reason for that? And I'll show you a little movie to explain how we created modernity and all our wealth and all our capacities of modern times, but we also created what the economists would call an externality, a side effect, which has turned out to be an existential externality. So here we go. This is what I call the sea story, not the history of human civilization. It starts in 1751, before the Industrial Revolution, and it shows you pixel by pixel the emissions from the use of coal in the beginning, later oil and gas. And you have to notice in particular that the coding, the color coding is logarithmic. That means each time the color changes, you multiply the emissions by a factor of 10. So 10 times 10 times 10 and so on. So let's get started. And you see the only colorful part of the world is Great Britain, England and Scotland so far. You see, but it is changing colors already, so moving towards the yellow. Nowhere else in the world any coal is used at a sort of reasonable and greater scale. And when you can, of course, ask what will be the next country in the world that will adopt the Industrial Revolution. Now we have the French Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution happened in Germany, actually, so that was the second country. And the third country was Poland. So if you wonder why the Polish are so obsessed with coal, it has a deep historical reason. And when you see how the Industrial Revolution, driven by the textile industry in particular, is spreading across Europe, UK is still ahead of the crowd, but now across the Atlantic, North America has joined the bandwagon, and we will see soon that something will happen, what we called at the time the British Empire. But Africa completely black, Latin America completely black, Australia and so on, Russia. Actually now India is joining the bandwagon, and very soon it will be New South Wales, so in Eastern Australia now, parts of Russia, and a little bit later Argentina will join the crowd, so we have a foundation from Argentina here. And you see now how the things are spreading, but what you probably have not noticed while watching is that Germany is developing into the second carbon power of the world. And this is, of course, creating all types of tensions. competition in economic, scientific terms, but also in military terms. So it comes to a certain showdown. In my view, the First World War was actually a struggle between the carbon powers of the world. It's over now, but Germany is not entirely defeated. So it keeps on militarizing, on investing into heavy industry and so on. Now we move towards the Second World War, actually. And Japan, which has developed into a carbon power, is actually joining that at Pearl Harbor. And now, after the alliance, the Allied forces won the Second World War, they have access to cheap oil in the Middle East. And that is bringing about what we call globalization. It was not coal, it was oil that was driving forward globalization. And now you see we are moving into this age where people thought there is only one direction for progress. We just go forward and forward and forward. And the world is turning colorful. Still, you have some black spots in Africa and in Siberia and in Alaska. And finally, a great new carbon power is rising, namely China. You see, China is turning red on this map within 20 years only and catching up with old Europe. Now, you can, of course, ask yourself, it stops here, will we go forward in the way that development means the whole planet has to turn red? If that would happen, we would have probably warming around 6 or 8 or 12 degrees. So I'll skip that because the moderator is nervous, so I immediately go to this plot here. So I introduced this map, I think around the year 2000. What will happen if the world, in terms of emissions, is really turning red? And what will happen is, of course, gradual change. Where temperatures are rising, water shortages and so on. But in particular, we will change the very machinery of our planet. That means the so-called tipping elements will be activated in the Earth system. That is, the great ice sheets, the big ecosystems, the circulation patterns in the ocean, thermaline circulation and so on, even the jet stream, which is organizing our weather on the northern hemisphere. And one by one, they will be tipped into a new state. So I give you a few examples only. For example, coral reefs. 1/3 of the marine productivity depends on coral reefs, but probably already with a warming of 1.5 degrees, we will lose 90% of his coral reefs. We have Mojib Latifi in the audience who wrote a wonderful book about the oceans, and I'm sure he feels very sad about this finding. So another big tipping element is Greenland ice sheet. According to our sort of latest insights, it may start to melt in an irreversible way, around 1.6 degrees warming. If we are really lucky, it only happens with 3 degrees warming. So let me summarize this. The world has taken notice of the warnings of the scientists. So we have in the left corner the Paris Agreement. So we see here Laurence Toubiana, cheerful at the podium. It was a major achievement to make it international law, actually, that global warming has to be kept well below 2 degrees centigrade. But I show you now how the risk related to the Paris Agreement looks like in scientific terms. So bear with me for a minute on that. So this is a paper we published last year in Nature Climate Change. What you first see is it goes back in time 20,000 years before present, and we look into the future till the year 2500. And you first see the global mean temperature. That's the wiggly line, you know, gray and blue. In blue, that is the time when our civilization emerged, the so-called Holocene. On the right-hand side, you see the various scenarios. If everything goes right, really everything goes right, we will keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. That's the green line. But look for the red line, actually. This is the course we are now on, actually. This is business as usual. It would actually, and on the vertical line on the left you see, it would take us to about 8 degrees warming by the year 2500. Now you see the Paris corridor here, the gray sort of bar here, 1.5 to 2 degrees. And when you see all the ranges where the tipping elements would be activated. So the Greenland ice sheet between 1.6 and 3 degrees. If the color turns red, we can be sure that this system will be tipped into a completely new state or it will be annihilated. And you see the Paris range is not a guarantee anymore that we will avoid all the major risks. We will probably lose the tropical reefs even if we hold the Paris line. It's very sad, but it can't be helped. We should have started to change the world already 3 decades ago. But even holding the 2 degrees line is a major achievement. So together with colleagues, we published in Science recently a so-called roadmap for rapid decarbonization, which more or less tells you the take-home message for you is a very simple one. Half carbon emissions every decade now, every decade. And this means that the renewable energies have to grow by 5 to 6% each year. So that is a tall order. It can be done, but it's not easy. And actually, this is the longer-term thing. A recent comment in Nature by Christiana Figueres, myself, and a few colleagues says, but we have to bend the curve towards decarbonization already by 2020. And I show you now what we call the carbon crunch. So that's the next slide here. And here you have to take notice again. So the global warming depends actually on the cumulative emissions, so the integral of emissions over decades, centuries, and so on. Now, let's assume we have about 600 gigatons CO2 left. That's the middle of the road expectation. And then it depends when will we peak global emissions. So if it happened in 2016, we would have to follow the blue line in decarbonization, and you see we will somehow see a petering out of carbon by 2050. If we do this in 2020, which is already very ambitious, we have to decarbonize our economy by 2040. But if, what is more likely, we peak in 2025, when the brown line applies. And this means decarbonization by 2033 or something, which seems unachievable. So you see, hurrying up, turning the tide immediately means immediately, is of the essence. Otherwise, we have wonderful meetings, G20, G19, whatever, or G18, that is, and we will keep talking about saving the world, but the world is lost already. Here is a crucial slide, which I was stealing from Bloomberg, which tells you that China is approaching a tipping point when it comes to the comparative cost of coal-fired power production and solar power production. And if you look closely, you see there is the large solar farms line in orange, the cost curve, so it's going down and down. And you see the coal line, which is slightly increasing. And the tipping point, the break-even point, is in 2022 or something. So that sounds very nice. But this will not save the world, actually. It's just a technological approach. Yeah? So if you keep going, it will take another 10 years until the market really absorbs this price advantage, and we will be too late. So my colleague Ottmar Edenhofer keeps on doing the argument, yes, reducing the cost by technological progress is one thing, but increasing the cost of the fossil is at the same time important. So while you move down by investment, the cost of solar and wind and so on, you have to move up the carbon cost by taxes. Only when we have the slightest chance to meet this challenge of turning the tide by 2020 and afterwards. So let me speak in the few minutes I've got left Let me speak about ethics and moral. So, as you have seen, technological progress, market forces alone will not do it. Governments have to intervene, but they will only do it if public opinion is forcing them to do so. So the divestment movement that was already mentioned is a powerful ethical force, of course, and has to come into play. Like what happened during the abolition of slavery some 150 years ago. And there was the Rockefeller fanfare recently, where an industrial dynasty says goodbye to fossil fuel. That was very important. It was symbolic in terms of volume of finance, but it was a game changer in my view. That has to keep. So let me conclude with two things. When we talk about moral, a certain person comes to mind. His name is Franciscus. So this is a meeting of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. I'm a member of that academy. It happened in Rome, in the Vatican, last November, and Pope Francis gave a wonderful speech about science and the responsibility of scientists to communicate with the public. You see on the right-hand side, in a wheelchair, the probably most famous scientist in the world, Stephen Hawking, has just given an interview for BBC where he says, maybe Trump's pullout of Paris is tipping the planet into oblivion. So I recommend to read that. But Pope Francis is actually one of the strongest forces in favor of climate action. So let me conclude, and I'm ahead of time, so I turned the tide of time, actually just in time. But that leaves me with a message I want to send to you in the end. Let me show you this. It probably has not caught your attention, but on June 29, the city of Avaz in Iran broke the record for temperature in June for all records taken ever, with a temperature of 33.7 degrees centigrade. Now, since the humidity is also very high, up to 70% there, the felt temperature was 60 degrees. And a little bit south in the city of Bandar in Mashhad, their humidity increased to around 90%. So the felt temperature was 74 degrees centigrade. You cannot survive without shelter in these conditions. So we're really talking about making large stretches of this planet inhabitable. And this happened now with 1 degree warming. So here my message, you, the foundations of the world, what sense does your work make at all if the very foundations of this world are crumbling away? That's why we have to turn the climate tide now. Thank you.